The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the module on optimizing team performance, and a warm welcome to wherever you're coming into this broadcast. We're well and truly in the Lunch and Learn series, and I hope you've had some opportunities to apply some of the learnings that you've got from the previous modules. And I'm going to do a little bit of a revision on the last module before we get underway today. So look, I just want to make sure that I'm coming across loud and clear. So the normal process, if you could just type in over on the question box just the word clear, that will help me know that I'm not talking to myself and I'm talking to an audience. So could you just type in the word clear, and that lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Okay, let's have a look. All right. Okay. Thank you, Darren. Thanks, Robert. Okay. Hello, June. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Marguerite. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is really good. Now, the normal process is that I, as you know, will send out the slides and the recording for this webinar soon as I can after today's presentation. So just relax, you don't need to take notes. You'll get all of the information that you need in an email from me very shortly. So let's get underway. You can see there on the left-hand side, it'll come up on your screen very soon. You can see the modules that we've gone through. We're now almost at the halfway point, or certainly will be at the end of today. We're talking about optimizing team performance, and we've looked at the ingredients of feedback, and I'm hoping you're still giving feedback, and I hope you haven't dropped the ball on that one. And of course, we looked at your influencing capabilities profile in module 2, and I'm hoping you've had an opportunity to practice some of your influencing capabilities and skills in the various, in your various dealings with other people. So we're going to look at optimizing team performance today as such, and I just wanted to make the point to you that I think personally that your primary role as a leader, is to get the very best from each member of your team. Now that, I suppose you could say you've got lots of roles, but I think at the end of the day, your job is about maximizing performance with each particular team member. Now, that, of course, is not always an easy thing to do because, if you rate people, for example, on a scale of 1 to 10, and let's say you think their performance is a 6, perhaps it might be unrealistic to think that I can get someone from a 6 to a 7, but it might, a 6 to a 10, but it might be possible to get them from a 6 to a 7. So in other words, we can achieve some degree of performance optimization, but it might not be at the level that you're satisfied with. But nevertheless, if you're managing, let's say, a team of 5, and you can actually increase everyone's performance by just 10%, then that's a 50% performance improvement in your team. And that's significant. So I think the way to look at this whole topic is to think, how can I extract a little bit of extra performance from each team member, not so much getting them to be performing at 10s, which might be unrealistic, if that makes sense to you. Thanks, Graham, loud and clear. Good, I'm pleased I'm coming across loud and clear. So that's the key thing here, is to try to get people from a 4 to a 5, or from a 6 to a 7, or from an 8 to a 9. And this module that we're going to look at today is about some of the strategies that you might use to do that. All right, so what are we going to be covering during today? Well, I'm going to talk about some myths around motivation, because there are a lot of myths about motivation. There are lots of misleading information about how you might motivate other people. So I want to dispel those before we move into a topic on what people actually want out of their job. And I've going to share with you some research from 9,000 people across several different continents and across 21 industries, and let you see what people actually want in their job, which I think is really important. And if we can look at a sample of 9,000 people across 21 industries, across a number of different cultures, then we can confidently say that here are the top 10 things that people want in their job. And as a leader, if you can fulfill those top 10 items as much as you probably can, then you're creating a motivational environment to get the very best out of the team that you lead. Now, whether or not people are motivated or not is their decision, but ultimately what you're doing is creating an environment where they can put their best foot forward, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here. We'll also look at job and non-job tasks, and obviously the job roles that people have are on their job description. These are the technical aspects of what they're supposed to be doing. But there's a whole nother element of performance that's often missing, and that is the non-job roles that people perform. And I'm going to share with you 4 non-job roles that people perform, and I believe that you should be really monitoring those non-job roles, because I think if you don't do that, then performance isn't complete. So you need to do that as such. And I'm going to finish off the session today with some models of motivation, some of the reputable models that are going on out there that have stood the test of time. Unfortunately, there isn't one model that we can all apply to, but there are many, and you've got to sift through some of these things, because motivation, of course, is quite a complex subject. It's not a simple case. And of course, the blind spot that you and I have is that what motivates us isn't necessarily what motivates other people. And that's really important to take on board, that people aren't necessarily motivated by what you're motivated by, and you've got to be very careful about how you go about that. So at any time during the presentation, if you've got questions or comments or observations, please don't feel shy, just type them in the question box there. I'll stop the presentation. I'm the only one that sees it, and of course I'll respond to it the moment I see it. Right, now this busy slide that's in front of you right now, what we first of all have to do is we have to define what we mean by motivation, because let's be clear about what motivation is and what it isn't. And there's a couple of dimensions to motivation that are important to get a grip of before we go any further. So you can see in the middle there is a definition, and it's basically reads, forces within an individual that account for the level, direction, and persistence of effort expended at work. Now, a couple of key things about that. You'll notice there's the forces within. So motivation is an inside job. In other words, it's the person's decision whether or not they become motivated. You and I cannot motivate people. We might like to think we can, but we actually can't. The ultimate decision is the individual's about whether they actually decide to be motivated. Now that's important, because if we spend the rest of our lives trying to motivate people, we're going to be deeply disappointed. All we can do is create the environment by which people may choose to become motivated. And you'll also notice in that definition there are 3 dimensions that I want to touch on. One is level, one is direction, and one is persistence. So I'd like to look at those 3 in more detail, because when we make generalizations about people and say that person over there is motivated, this person over here is not motivated, what are we actually really saying? I think sometimes we generalize too much about that. So let's look at the first level, or the first dimension, if you like, and that is direction. So this is the person's choice when presented with a number of alternatives. So this is the focus of the person. So motivation has a lot to do with focus. We've all seen people doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. And, you scratch your head, or you might talk to them and say, well, why are you doing that project when you should be doing this thing over here? So motivation's got a lot to do with the focus of the individual on the task at hand. So a person that's highly motivated knows what they should be doing and is able to apply themselves to that task. All right, now that's one level of motivation, because obviously if you're working on the wrong thing at the wrong time and even in the wrong way, then you're clearly not being very productive. So the direction that the person puts their effort into is one of the three dimensions of motivation. And the next one, going clockwise, is persistence. This is really how long someone sticks at a course of action. So if someone has a go at something and drops the ball very quickly after a first attempt, you could argue that they're failing that dimension of motivation. People who are motivated are persistent. They will stick at the task until the task is done, no matter what the barriers are in the way. So what we're looking for is a degree of persistence in terms of their ability to stick to the task at hand, assuming, of course, it's the right task. And the third dimension is the level, that is the intensity of effort put forth by the person, the actual intensity. So the intensity of effort is how much energy I put into the task that I'm actually conducting. All right, so does that make sense? So you've got, where is my direction? How persistent am I? And what is the level of intensity that I'm putting into this task? When you throw all of those things into the melting pot, you can then determine whether or not somebody in fact is motivated. Now, the good news about this topic is that when you see somebody who you believe is not motivated, you can then ask yourself the intelligent question, is it the direction? Is it the level of persistence? Or is it the level of intensity that they're putting into their work? Or perhaps is it all three? And that way you can then address the dimension related to that. So, for example, if there's a lot of persistence in the work that they're doing, so they're quite dogged and not willing to give up, there's a fair degree of intensity in the effort, but they're actually not doing the right thing in the right way. In other words, their direction, their priorities are out. Then I can talk to them about priorities rather than just a sweeping statement around, you need to get more motivated. So this will help you to look at other people and work out what's missing. Is it the direction? Is it their persistence? Or is it the intensity level? And that in itself can help. So a highly motivated person can be described as someone who has their priorities clear, is willing to put in until they achieve success, and they're intense in the work that they do. All right, so that's a definition of motivation that I'm sure can be very helpful for you. Now, what I want to do now is look at some of these myths I mentioned at the outset and look at some of the myths around motivation and perhaps get you to start thinking a little bit about some of these myths. And these myths are perpetuated by our media, they're perpetuated by a lot of management books and articles, and I just want to make sure that we're absolutely clear about what we mean. Now, these aren't necessarily in any order, but the first myth here, and I've sort of alluded to this already, is that you can't actually motivate people. You can't, I can't, nobody can. You can only provide the circumstances by which people become motivated. It's their choice ultimately. And let me give you an example. If you and I went, for example, to go along to see a motivational speaker, say an Anthony Robbins, and we were sitting in the audience and we sat there for the whole day, and you walked out and you said, wasn't that absolutely fantastic? I feel like I'm on fire. And I said, no, I didn't get a thing out of it. Didn't do a thing for me. We were exposed to exactly the same stimuli, but yet I came out demotivated and you came out motivated. Why? Because it's your choice to be motivated, and it's my choice to be demotivated. We still were exposed to what was potentially a motivational event, you see. So it's important for us to just be aware of that. And it was very important for me to learn this when I started out managing, because for a long period of time, what I was trying to do was to motivate people. And then I discovered that I actually couldn't do that. I can only create the circumstances by which people make that decision themselves. And once I understood that, it was very liberating. It took a lot of pressure off. Didn't mean I gave up on people. It just simply meant that it was my job just to create the environment, and then it's then up to them whether they step up to the plate, so to speak. So there's a myth around that we can motivate people, and it's not true. There's another myth that some people are not motivated and others are. We make these sweeping generalizations that person over there is motivated, but this one isn't. The truth is that we're all motivated to some degree. Now, just getting out of bed this morning was a motivation. Now, some people would have got out of bed from fear of not getting out of bed and perhaps being late to a meeting, and other people would have bounced out of bed because they couldn't wait to take on and seize the day. But for both of those people, they were motivated. One was a negative force and one was a positive force. So really, everybody, in a sense, has a degree of motivation. The issue in our workplace is that some people are not inspired. And it's interesting that 70% of surveys show that 70% of people are not engaged in their work, which is incredible. And so what that really means is it's not that they're not motivated, it's just that they're not inspired. So it's important for us to realise and recognise that. And if you doubt that, think about the person that you believe is the most demotivated person in your team. I'll guarantee if you sat down and had a coffee with them and just talked to them about their personal interests, you would get a completely different insight into them. You would find that they'd have hobbies and interests where they're quite dedicated and they're quite engaged in it. So we've all got some degree of motivation. It's a question of how we might tap into that. Now, if you doubt that, think, if you're near a body of water, think about this demotivated person in your team and imagine taking them out into the water, and perhaps you might be waist high in the water, and you grab them by the scruff of the neck and you push their head down into the water and you held it there for as long as you probably could. You will find that they will be extremely motivated to come to the surface. They will struggle and they will push and prod. They'll do whatever they can to come to the surface. In other words, they have an innate motivation to survive. So we've all got this, and it's important for us to not make the distinction that some are motivated and some aren't. The third myth is that, and it's not so much a myth, but the motivation is subjective. In other words, it's a very personal matter. That what motivates you and what motivates me is not what motivates other people. And this is very, very important, because a lot of leaders are motivated by achievement and competition. But the reality is that some of the people you lead are not motivated by those things. And yet what we try to do is we try to impose our own motivational forces on other people. It's not a good idea. What you should do is spend a little bit of time talking to people again and finding out what makes them tick. So what do they want out of their work? Why are they doing this? I recently did a job for a police service in Australia, and one of the senior managers mentioned to me that one of his officers, who was sort of in their early 50s, had lost all interest and all motivation. And he was asking me for advice about what he thought that I could do, perhaps, to change that. I mentioned to him that I thought it would be a good idea for him to ask him why he joined the service in the first place. Why did you join the police? What did you, because obviously it's not for everybody. It's people would argue it's a calling. I certainly wouldn't want to do it, but I admire and respect those that do. And just to ask that person, and not to wait necessarily for an answer, but just to spin on your heels and get out of there and then perhaps come back in a couple of days' time and ask them what they thought. And what that did was spark an interest in the person to reconnect with the values that were critically important around community, that really sparked an interest in this person having a lifelong career in the police. So everybody's different, and it's important to find out what it is that motivates people. Another myth is that, motivation or intrinsic motivation is more powerful than extrinsic motivation. We tend to give people rewards, we tend to give people punishment even, and this is what is called extrinsic motivation, outside, external. We try to motivate people by imposing certain rewards and punishments to get people to behave in certain ways. But the ultimate really is intrinsic motivation. And if you talk to any recruiter, they will tell you that ultimately you're better off finding somebody that has a fair degree of intrinsic motivation rather than trying to use the carrot and the stick to change people. And I think it's very true that some people are better at being motivated intrinsically. So it's about appealing to people's self-interest and what's in it for them. And once you've internalized that motivation, it becomes very, very powerful. Now, here's a debatable topic, and I'd like you to have a think about this. I'd be quite interested to hear what you have to say about it. But money is an overestimated force in terms of motivation. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying money's not important. I guarantee if you stop paying people tomorrow, they would be very quickly demotivated. But the reality is we overestimate its importance. At the end of the day, money is paper and metal. And as paper and metal, it holds actually no worth other than what it can actually do for us. And obviously that's the critically important aspect. But it's surprising to me how much other factors beyond money are actually motivational forces. So in other words, if we decided to increase people's wages by 50%, if we could do that, would we get 50% increase in productivity? I don't think so. We might initially get a burst of productivity, but after a while we wouldn't. So money, to a certain point, is a motivational force. But beyond that, there are other factors that people want. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, even though a lot of us talk about money all the time, and I'm not suggesting that money's not important, it's just overestimated. That's the critically important word in that definition. So, people want all sorts of things as such. I'm just going to respond to a question here that we've got. Graham asks, do you think that this motivational factor has changed over recent times? It's a good question, Graham. I think you'll hear a lot of people talking about money. And the first important thing, of course, is that they're not talking about money. They're talking about sort of what the money can do. I think that's the first important distinction. But I'm not convinced. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago, for example, that when the mining boom was in place, there were lots of people who left local government to go and work in the mines. But not everyone did. There wasn't a mass exodus. Now, people could actually double their wages by working in the mines. And, that's a pretty significant increase, 100% increase in wages just by transitioning to a mine. Well, what we found was that a lot of people decided to stay because they liked the perks of local government. They liked the 9-day fortnight. They liked the camaraderie and they liked the friendships that they developed in the council. These things ultimately were more important than the monetary gain of moving to the mines. So I think, Graham, it's probably fair to say that it is overestimated. But of course, that's not to suggest that some people aren't chasing the dollar every minute of the day. But I suspect that if we fall into the trap of assuming that everyone's like that, we're missing huge opportunities to motivate people. So I hope that's helped respond to that question. Another factor is, and if we sort of simplify it, another factor that's critically important is that people are motivated by two forces. And Anthony Robbins talks about this, Awaken the Giant Within, which incidentally is a wonderful book. And he talks about the pain-pleasure principle. In other words, everything that we say, think, and do is about avoiding pain, or on the other hand, seeking pleasure. So we are pain avoiders and pleasure seekers. So let me give you an example. The difference, of course, is that pain and pleasure are different for everybody. So look, two people at traffic lights in two cars, side by side. They're both going to work. They're both attending the same meeting. The person in the first car, and they're both late. Let's say they're both late. The person in the first car isn't getting too stressed about it and just says to themselves, it is what it is, and just listens to some music on the radio and just waits for the traffic light to change, rationalizing that there's nothing that they themselves can do about the circumstance. Person B in the car next to them is stressing and shouting and screaming at the traffic lights, wanting them to desperately to turn green so that they can arrive at the meeting not too late and not lose too much face. So the same pain principle has occurred for both, that is, being late to a meeting, yet one person has interpreted it differently to the other. And this is the complexity of the principle, is that we all interpret pain differently. We all interpret pleasure differently. So again, the critical thing is to find out what makes people tick and what are the things that are important to people, because you can't always work that out. All right, so let's move on. So there's a few sort of myths around that. Now, here are the 10 qualities that employees want in a job. Now, remember, this is significant. This is significant survey data from Harvard that is not culturally just in the United States. This is across a number of continents. And basically, what people were asked was a simple question. If there was one quality that was more important to you than any other quality in your work, what would it be? Simple question. So people just on a piece of paper had to write down whatever that quality was and submit that. And then what you're going to see now is the top 10 qualities in terms of frequency. So the first one will be the one that was mentioned most frequently of the 9,000 people interviewed, and the second one was the second most frequent, and so on. Do you want to have a guess what do you think might be number one on the list? You might be actually very surprised at what number one is, but when you see it, it'll probably make a lot of sense to you. So why don't you just type in over on the right hand side what you think, and I can't give you a prize, of course, but you can get the pleasure of knowing that you're successful. So just type over on the question box what you think might be the number one quality that came out of the survey that people want in a job. Okay, Darren says security. That's interesting. Yes, I think that was on the list somewhere. Certainly wasn't number one, I might say. Right. Appreciation, says Robert. Yeah, appreciation does feature. Graham also says security. All right, anybody else want to have a go before I show you? All right, here's we've got another one there. I'll just check that out. Autonomy. Tim, you're pretty close to the mark, actually. Well done. Vicky says autonomy. Sorry, Tim says autonomy. Robert says fun and enjoyment. Vicky says to feel valued. All of those things are featuring. Carlos says recognition. Okay, well, you're on the money, but here we go. Number one. Now remember, this is 9,000 people. To work for efficient managers. Who would have thought? Now, that might seem a little bit strange up front but when you actually think about the logic of that, People who often leave workplaces, and those of you that conduct exit interviews would know this intimately, that often people don't leave organisations, they leave people. In other words, it's often a difficult relationship between the individual and the boss. And let's face it, if the boss is creating the environment, the correct environment, then a lot of these other factors that you've mentioned over here in the question box are probably going to be real. So the implications for you and me are pretty straightforward, aren't they? We've got to work at building our own leadership capabilities, because if we do, we are actually not only going to be more effective in what we do, we're also going to be more appreciated by the people that we are leading. So that's number one. Now, so the rest of them are very much around a lot of things that you were mentioning. Number two, and I forgot who mentioned autonomy. Let's just have a look. Yeah, Tim, you get the gig, you get the gong. To think for themselves. So number two was and of course some of you are thinking, well, I wish my people would think for themselves. But actually, autonomy is really important. So micromanaging people actually is not a good idea for the reasons that you're hearing there. So we want people to think for themselves, to make decisions and so forth. If they're not doing that, then you have to ask yourself the question, what am I doing to prevent that? Number three. Now, this is an interesting one. No one mentioned this, but if you think about it, it's very real. To see the end result of my work. People want to see that, they want to see the why of work. As Simon Sinek talks about the why of work, they want to see that there are results in the end of their work. In other words, I did a little survey in a local government environment. I surveyed the outdoor staff. These are the people that work on the roads and fill the potholes in and all that kind of thing. And I surveyed the indoor staff. I simply asked them a question on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low. How would you rate your level of motivation right now? And this result was very interesting. The people in the office rated it a 6, and the people in the outdoor, this is aggregate, rated it a 7. I said to the people outdoors, why did you rate it as you did? And they said, because we can actually see the bridge we've built, we can see the pothole that we've filled in, we can see the gate that we've mended, we can see the vegetation that's been, dealt with. So this is very interesting, because what it means is that you and I have got to try to link what people do day to day with the big picture. And if we can do that, and of course in some occupations that's easy, say for example in a not-for-profit, it's not hard to do that, because in a not-for-profit, of course, people are there for a cause, and they'll often see the end result of what they do. So for example, if you're working with homeless youth, you can see the good work that you're doing. So in some of your organisations, you have to make an effort to think, how can I connect this boring, mundane report with what they actually will achieve in the end? And that, in some professions, is not so easy to do. Number 4 on the list is to be assigned interesting work. And that's great. And in fact, I think, Robert mentioned fun and enjoyment. And I suppose that comes into play there. People want interesting, challenging assignments to do. Now, a lot of work is drudgery. We accept that. And in fact, there's not much you can do about some of that. It doesn't matter what profession it is, there's some drudgery involved. But as leaders, if we don't be consciously trying to create a stimulating environment by challenging people with interesting projects, we're probably not going to fulfill number 4 on the list. Number 5 on the list is, and interestingly enough, nobody mentioned this, that people want to be kept informed. They want to know what's going on. This is the biggest complaint, is it not? People will often say, nobody tells me anything around here. There's two things that people want in their work. They want to be informed about where the organisation is heading, and they want to be informed about their work. So they need a macro and a micro information channel. How am I going in my work? And that's what feedback's about, incidentally. And also, where is the organisation going, and how is that going to impact on the work that I do here? So we need to be doing a lot more communicating and informing than we perhaps do. Number 6 is they want people to listen to them. Now, this is quite important because Vicky mentioned to feel valued. Robert mentioned appreciation. So these things are extremely important. So and the best way to do that is by listening to people. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because you're sitting there thinking, I know what this person's going to say, and everything that they've said is rubbish, and why wouldn't this next thing be the same? So you just got to bite your tongue until it bleeds and give the person the time and respect. You will be amazed at how effective that actually is. And then to paraphrase what you've heard back. But that's what, remember, this is what employees are saying. This is not what managers are saying. This is employees' feedback. Number 7, to be respected. And of course, a number of you mentioned that. They want to feel respected. They want to be respected as people, and of course, you know, showing respect to people can be done in a lot of different ways. Saying thank you for the effort put in is a sign of respect. Giving people prior notice is a sign of respect. Giving people a chance to speak up in meetings is a sign of respect. These are the little things that add up to number 7. Number 8 is to be recognised for their effort. They want feedback, in other words, and they want people to be able to acknowledge the good work that people do, and that is directly in your line of fire. So thank people, let people know genuinely when you're happy, and when you're not happy, you should also let them know as well. People will appreciate that. Number 9 is to be challenged, and some of you are thinking, well, I wish some of my people did want to be challenged, but the reality is, of course, there's different thresholds around challenge. Some people want to be challenged more than others, but at the end of the day, it made the list at number 9. So we need to give people more challenges, and not to and to encourage them with those challenges. Just because people want to be challenged doesn't necessarily mean that they feel that they've got the wherewithal to achieve what it is that you challenge them with. So we have to encourage them as well. And number 10 is that people want to develop. They want opportunities for skill development, and that's what the learning and development programs and organisations are all about. So an interesting list, isn't it? Now, if you look at that list in front of you, there's nothing terribly surprising about that. I think probably the one that's quite surprising is number 1, but if you think about it, number 1, if you think about all the other 9 things, then all the other 9 things pretty much lock into place in the efficient managers. So if you've got an efficient manager, you're probably being kept informed, you're probably being listened to, there is probably a sense of respect there, some recognition, you're given challenges. So you can see where people are coming from collectively when they make that list of 10 things. All right, so I guess the question you've got to ask yourself is, which of those balls do I not have in the air, and which of those balls should I make more effort to have in the air? And if you want to know one that you can have a difference, make a difference on immediately, but it's elusively difficult, it's number 6, to be listened to. If you just spend time listening to people, you will find you'll get enormously good results coming back. Okay, so if you have one person who's just not motivated, what do you do? So they might not seem very motivated, and you're sort of struggling with that. And I'd be surprised if you didn't have someone like that. Most people do. What do you do? Well, there's a simple answer for that. You ask them. You ask them. What do you ask them? Well, you simply say, Is there anything that I can do or perhaps not do that might assist with you in your work right now? So put it on the line. Ask people how you might be able to assist to develop their own motivational levels. It may not have anything to do with you, incidentally, because people have complex home lives and all sorts of interesting things occur. And of course, we ebb and flow in our motivational levels. But it's courtesy and it's respect to just ask people, is there anything that I can do as your leader to make life easier for you or to improve everything? What do you just have a conversation about that. You'd be surprised at what people might tell you. But even if they tell you nothing, it sends a very strong message and signal that you are in earnest attempting to do your best to lead the people. All right, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So the question down the bottom there, for example, is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you be more engaged in your work? Okay, so ask the question. You may not get the answer you want, but you may also send a very clear message that you're interested in their welfare to a point where you're willing to ask that question. So that's something that you can do immediately. All right, now I want to just talk a little bit around non-job. You recall me mentioning non-job roles, and I want to mention this to you. It comes from one of my books that you can see there in front of you at the bottom, but I just want to share with you this one model that I think can make a significant difference in terms of your ability to get the best from the people that you lead. Let's have a look at it. Now, if we look at the work that people do, we can divide it up into two dimensions. The first dimension we can look at is the job role. So the job role is actually the technical requirements of the work that people do. Now, I'm not going to touch that because it's on their job description. People, that's their technical qualifications, that's the technical work that they do. So that's one dimension, but unfortunately what happens is we spend all our time just working on that dimension. All the while there's this whole other dimension that we haven't even talked about. So let's talk about that. And this, of course, is the non-job roles that people play. Now, this isn't something new. Non-job roles have been around for a long time. But one of the problems that has stalled people to come up with a non-job role framework is that people were concerned that in different industries would have different requirements. And because of that, it wasn't possible to generalize a framework that was applicable across all 21 industries. Well, I decided to take up that challenge and come up with 4 non-job roles that I think are applicable to every single industry on the planet. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm more than happy for you to do that. But these are the 4 non-job roles that I think, 1, are critically important to performance, and 2, are applicable to every single industry. One of the non-job roles is to have a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Now, I'm not expecting people to come to work bouncing off the walls. That's not the sort of thing that I'm talking about. But I certainly don't expect people to come to work bitching and moaning and complaining and backbiting and pointing the finger of blame and not taking responsibility. Now, we all know that behavior is very real, and we all probably see it every day. And what that does is it undermines the morale, or as the French call it, the esprit de corps in the team. And the team are absolutely no better off for somebody that does that. So in my view, an important non-job role is just to be positive in the work that you do. Now, I would challenge you that if you've got someone that's less than positive and they undermine the good work that you try to achieve in your team, then I believe, as I talked about last module, that you need to have a conversation with them about that. And don't be afraid to do it, because if they're negative and they're dragging people down, you've got to work doubly hard to get people back to where you want them. So just have a talk to them and use very specific language. For example, you may say to someone, look, the last 4 comments that you made in our team meetings had all been negative. Now, that's the reality of it. And whilst you may have had a good reason for making those, I'm sure you do, and I'm sure there was a good reason for it, my concern is the impact that those comments may have had on other people in the room, right? Let's talk about it. So, you can train people. If you say nothing about that, then you are virtually saying that that behaviour is acceptable. And I don't believe it is. So people do not have to be negative at work. They may choose to be, but if there's no consequences to be other than that, then why would they want to change? So that's a role. Another role is a team role. We expect people to operate as team players, don't we? But I hear it all the time, people saying, oh, I'm not a team player, I'm an individual, I don't play in teams. Well, I'm sorry, you need to play in teams, because that's the way the world works, and people who are in the workplace are working in teams. So don't accept that rubbish. Just confront people and say, well, I need you to be a team player. I need you to learn the skills or the competencies around being a team player. Will you do that for me? And you just look them straight in the eye and you ask that question. Now, we just expect people to be able to work in teams, but it's surprising how few people can actually do that. Another role that's critically important is the career role. We want people to grow and develop their career in the role that they are in currently. And what that really entails is building a skill base up. In other words, building and expanding on their skill set so that those skills can be applied to the current job that they're in. But again, how often do you hear people saying, oh, I'm too old to learn, or I just like doing things this way, and I'm not really interested in upgrading my computer skills because I've always been doing things this way. Well, you know what? That's actually impacting on all of our productivity, and you just need to bite the bullet and get out and actually learn a new set of skills. So skill development is a non-job role. To learn and have the right attitude to learning is critically important in 2018 and will continue to be, without a doubt. And finally, the fourth role is a role around innovation and continuous improvement. We want people to bring their brains to work with them and not leave them in a paper bag at the doorway. And we want people to think about ways of making the workplace efficient and effective. All right, we want their ideas. Now, you won't get their ideas unless you ask for them. And so, but not only should you ask for them, I would be expecting that people would be thinking about these things. Now, a lot of people don't. They assume that it's your job, and, it is partly, but it's also their responsibility as well to come up with ways and means of making the organisation or the workplace that they're in more efficient and more effective. So have a think about this. If you doubt the power, the potency of these 4 non-job roles, consider this. Consider an organisation that's highly technically skilled. In other words, over on the left-hand side, they've got great technical skills. These people are the top of the game. They've got the highest education standards. So that's been done, but they have none of the 4 non-job roles. In other words, everyone's got a moaning, whinging, complaining, negative attitude. Nobody is willing to work in teams. Nobody is willing to build their skill set up beyond what they currently have. And everybody is not committed to making the workplace more efficient and effective. Do you think that would be a high-performing workplace? I think not. So you can see that what I'm encouraging you to do is to have conversations around attitude, teams, careers, and innovation and continuous improvement. If you have conversations around those four, what you're doing is you're broadening the scope of performance beyond just simply the technical requirements of what people do. So food for thought. I hope that's encouraged you to have a few of those conversations that we've probably shirked in the past because we don't want to open a can of worms up. The can of worms is already open if they're not performing those non-job roles. So we might as well get into it and have a conversation with people about that. All right, so if you've got any comments or questions about any of that, you know what to do. So while you might be thinking about that, let me share with you a couple of motivational theories. We've got about 8 minutes to go, and I just wanted to share with you a couple of these. Now, there's a lot of theories out there, as I said. I've just picked a couple that I think make a lot of sense. The first one is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of you probably would have seen it before. In fact, when Abraham Maslow put this together, in I think it was the 1930s, he actually drew it out on a napkin, in a restaurant. And in fact, since then he had been quite embarrassed about how incredibly popular his theory became, and it has. I think one of the reasons is because it's so simple and so relevant. So he argues that we all have a series of needs, and once one of these needs has been fulfilled, it no longer becomes a driving force, and there's a new need that's required. And he argues that the most fundamental need is air, food, and water. That is, the physiological needs at the bottom of the pyramid. He argues that if we don't have air, food, and water, then nothing else is important, because that's our only primary source of survival at that point. And then once that's been fulfilled, we need to feel safe. And we need to feel safe both physically and psychologically. And so that's the next key thing. And then he argues that the next three things are directly in your line of sight in an organization. You can argue that most people are, not all people, but most people are physiologically and from a safety point of view, those needs have been fulfilled. So when they get to work, they want to feel a sense of belonging, they want to feel a sense of accomplishment, and they want to feel a sense of self-actualization or improving on one's potential. Now, not everybody's at the tip of the apex, and you may well be, and this might be a big mistake, that you're assuming that everyone wants to be challenged because that's where you're at. But some people just want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel that they're part of the team. And once they feel part of the team, they need to feel that their comment and contribution is worthy, has some currency. So we want to listen to what people have to say. Now, if those two needs have been fulfilled, then it's likely that people will want to stretch and grow, which of course is the self-actualization need. So I would argue, despite what you might think, is that most people in your organization have belonging and accomplishment needs that are not fulfilled. So being a team and listening to people is critically important. So that's a great theory because it's simple to understand. Another theory, which is a little bit busier, is McGregor's theory X and theory Y. Now, Douglas McGregor was the very first theorist that came up with the notion that really your attitude about people will have a huge impact on the level of motivation in your team. So he argued that there were two types of leaders. There was theory X and theory Y. And theory X leaders, and I'm sure some of you have worked for theory X leaders, it's not all that pleasant because you can see that in the middle is the kind of orientation or sphere, What are Theory X managers like? Well, Theory X managers they believe that people dislike work. They find it boring and will avoid it if they can. They believe that employees need to be forced or coerced into compliance, that they won't do it of their own free will. They believe that people need to be directed, and that's the job of a leader, and that if they're not directed, they will avoid responsibility. They believe that leading by fear is in fact a really significant, important part of motivation. And they believe that people have little creativity, don't think for themselves, and you just have to put a set of rules in place. Now, if you've ever been led by a person that has that attitude, you know that it's not terribly motivating. Hopefully you're not being led by a person like that. Now, hopefully you're not like that. Now, over on the right-hand side, you've got the Theory Y manager, which is the exact opposite. They believe that people have a fundamental need to work. They believe that people are self-directed. They believe that people thrive on responsibility. They believe that people want to develop themselves, and that given an opportunity, people can be quite creative. Now, of course, a lot of us are in flux between Theory X and Theory Y, but certainly you can imagine which of those two mindsets for a leader would be more applicable for creating a motivational environment, and it's what's on the right-hand side. So you need to question yourself and your own beliefs about people to, first of all, ask yourself, am I a Theory X or am I a Theory Y manager? So that can be very, very interesting in itself. Okay. Vicky's just asking, I'd like to know your definition of the qualities that constitute an effective manager in the 10 quality survey. I think, Vicky, the answer to that is the other 9 qualities that have been put there. So in other words, I believe that an efficient manager is a listener. I believe an efficient manager is someone that encourages. I believe an efficient manager is somebody that treats people with respect. So essentially, I think the other 9 qualities are really a summation of what an effective leader is, if that makes sense. To me, that makes perfect sense. And if you look at those 9 things on that list, they are all part, in my view, of being an efficient manager, which was number 1. So hopefully that's responded to your question. Okay, now, Daniel Pink, and there's a great book called Drive, believed that knowledge workers, that is people that work in offices and work with information and knowledge, need fundamentally 3 things. And it's a great theory. So what Daniel Pink argues is that the carrot and the stick are not as effective as we might think. So in other words, giving people rewards or sanctioning behaviour based on KPIs is not as effective as we might have first thought. He does argue that it's very, very helpful for people in semi or non-skilled profession areas, but with people who have a reasonable level of skill and a reasonable level of education, it doesn't work very well. He argues that there are 3 things or 3 factors that are critically important that we should be doing to create a motivational environment. He argues that people should be given the autonomy and the freedom to make their decisions around the work that they do. So and you might recall that was one of the 10 things that was on the list, and some of you mentioned that before it was even put up. So giving people the freedom and autonomy to make their own decisions about what they do, when they do it, and how they do it is a motivational force. Daniel Pink also says that people must feel a sense of mastery, and what he means by that is that they must be given skills to develop themselves. And he also argues that people should know the why of work. So why am I doing what I'm doing, and what is the outcome of that? So it's a great model, and one that I think that you can take away with you. So much so, in fact, that that's your homework. What I'd like you to do is is what you're seeing on your screen now is a list of a summation of all the things that practically you can do as a result of what you've learned today with me. So you can have a look at that when I send you the slides. And what I want to do now is just give you some homework to do, some things to focus on. So I'd like you to use autonomy, mastery, and purpose in your leadership decisions and conversations, and stick with it no matter what. So I want you to somewhere to write down the words autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and just every conversation, every decision that you make, you start thinking, how can I give people more autonomy? How can I help them build their skill level up? And how can I give them some clarity and direction around the big picture? If you do that and nothing else, you will get people from a 6 to a 7 or a 3 to a 4. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. So thanks, folks. I've enjoyed working with you today. And next time we meet, of course, we will look at the next unit and go from there. So which will be, of course, Unit 5. And you'll have a little diagnostic to do there, but this will be a paper and pencil one on understanding people and their personalities. So thanks, folks. I wish you all the best. And, of course, I'm always available on email if you choose to want to make contact with me then. So I wish you all the best. Have a wonderful weekend. And start this afternoon on autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Thank you and goodbye.